You're listening to the Missionary Perspective Podcast with veteran missionaries Eric Johnson and Joshua Mead. We're glad you could join us. We trust this podcast will be both a blessing and a challenge as we relate topics in world evangelism from a missionary perspective. Now, here's Josh and Eric.
Welcome to the Missionary Perspective Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Johnson, and here today I'm joined live by two of my good friends, Dennis and Lorrie Harry. Pastor Dennis Harry and his wife, Lorrie, are pastor and missionary, pastor's wife. I'm going to go nervous. I'm going to read that again, all right? Sorry. Yeah. Blah, 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 blah. All right, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Missionary Perspective Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Johnson, and today we're live with two of my good friends, Pastor Dennis Harry and his wife, Lorrie. Pastor Harry serves as a pastor at Needhams Grove Baptist Church in Seagrove, North Carolina. The Harrys have been married now for 27 years and have 4 children. They also are the hosts of one of the podcasts my wife and I listen to, a wonderful podcast entitled the Better Together Podcast for Christian couples and parents. Thank you guys for joining us today.
Well, we are excited to join you, Eric, and looking forward to being able to talk about our podcast, but also just some of the ministry things we've talked about while we've been here on our visit to the Dominican.
Now, Pastor Harry and I spoke about a little over a year ago on a podcast. We had a 2-part podcast. We talked briefly about their podcast, Better Together, but today we're going to take advantage of having them here live with us in the Dominican Republic. And so before we get jumping into the podcast, let's give those who are listening or watching today a little background on you guys, a little outline of who you guys are and maybe how you guys got involved in ministry. You've been in multiple ministries, and the current status of your family today. So many years encapsulated into a few minutes.
So I'll start off with the background part, and then you can tell everybody where we are currently. How does that work? Okay. So background part, Lorrie and I were both trained as educators and thought that we would be in Christian education our whole lives. But about 20 years ago, the Lord directed our steps into pastoral ministry, and was a youth pastor for 10 years. And then I thought, well, I'll just be a youth pastor the rest of my life.
Right.
And then the Lord directed our steps to Central North Carolina, where we've been now for 10 years. Wow. And so the Lord has really blessed us there. As far as the background for our podcast, when we hit 25 years of marriage, I think you'll understand this, Eric, there comes a point in ministry where you feel like maybe you have a little bit to give back. Not that you have all the answers. We don't have all the answers. Believe me, anytime we go to a parenting conference or marriage conference, we tell people we don't have the answers, but we can tell people about our experiences. And so when we hit 25 years, we felt like we had enough experience to be able to maybe share some of that back with people. And so I came to Lorrie one day and I said, hey, Lorrie, we're going to start a podcast. And she, by faith, stepped out with me. And
it wasn't, will we? We are going to.
And it has been great to just talk about life and to talk about marriage and parenting. And so that's the background of our podcast. So now, Lorrie, tell us then about our family, where we are.
Sure. So we have 4 children, ages 25, 23, soon to be 21, and soon to be 18. So we are
names.
Okay, the oldest is Caitlin, and then Andrew, Emma, and then Laurel is the youngest. She is a senior in high school currently. So we're reaching that stage in life where they're all out of the house. We have 2 that are married. Our oldest 2 are married, and the blessing is they are all in the same place. They are all down in Florida, so we can go visit them all in one place, and we can see them all when we go and visit them. And the youngest will be joining them down there next fall. So that's where we are now, at a stage where it goes by so quickly. We're about to be empty nesters, and the 2 of us sticking together forever.
Well, it's funny, you talk about better together, and you do stick together, but you do like to spend a lot of time with your family, and you tend to go try to be around the kids a lot, which is exciting, and probably are going to be going into some new transitions in life, not just being empty nester, but maybe in the next couple of years being grandparents as well, or the Lord allows. So those are exciting transitional times, but 27 years of marriage is a good long time. And so we want to go on to the next point, which is we want to know a little bit of how you guys kind of came to this. I know you told her one day you're going to have it, but kind of what was germinating in your mind to say, hey, we should start letting others know about some of these experiences we've had.
So in pastoral ministry, and Eric, you'll recognize this, a lot of times you are ministering to people that are going through unique circumstances in their life. And what we found as we were reaching the 20 to 25 year mark in marriage, and then as our children were now older, and especially when our children started going to college and were kind of moving out of the teenage age, those teenage years, that several of the experiences we were giving people encouragement on were things that we had also gone through. When you've been married for 15 years and your kids are all really young and you're in the middle of it, you don't have experiences, you are actually experiencing it, And it wasn't until we had sort of come on the other side of trial and error, learning through mistakes, learning things that we could do better as parents, that we felt like maybe we had a little bit of wisdom from things that we had experienced. And honestly, there were kind of two reasons sort of that year that sort of were heavy on my mind. Number one, our children were coming to the age where they were going to get married. Mm-hmm. And this sort of became a permanent memorial, something that we could pass along to our kids, that they could listen to as they head off into marriage and as they head off into parenting. I don't know how many years we'll record this. We're in our third season. This has been a pretty sparse season so far, but that's okay. We're in our third season. And, if we make it to 4 or 5 seasons, my goal would be to continue paying for the hosting so that our kids can continue to listen back to episodes, even if nobody else listens to it. So it was for our kids. But then it also was for our church families. We felt like there were a lot of church families that were going through experiences that we had gone through, and to be able to, so we actually did some Sunday school series where we would deal with a lot of parenting stuff, but there's only so much time during the week or on Sundays or in Sunday school. And, to do very specific topics in a sermon is kind of odd because, in a church, you have people that aren't married and you have people that are widows, and it just doesn't apply to them. So we felt like doing a podcast would give us an opportunity to sort of memorialize all of that and really be able to just share our experiences. And it's been a blessing. It has been challenging for us to think back to our marriage and our parenting and to really put our finger on why we did what we did. And I'm thankful that we had mentors all along that helped us along that process. So that's sort of why we wanted to begin the podcast process.
I hadn't thought of this question until just now, but how are your kids responding to this? What do they think of it?
It's interesting.
You open a little bit of the doors to their lives, but it's not like real, this kid did this bad thing kind of sort of thing.
Sure. Well, they listen to them. Uh-huh. So it's always interesting that they usually go out on Wednesdays, and when they go out, the kids do listen to them and they laugh because they're stories that obviously they experienced. And we are very open and honest through our podcast. I know you've listened to them. Yep. I mean, we don't just tell all the good stuff. Right. Because every home has their struggles, and our kids knew the struggles, and often it was the struggles we were having, learning how to be parents. Until you go through each stage, you're new at that stage. And so we had many times where we had to sit down and just admit to our kids that we messed up. We did not handle this situation the right way. And our kids, as they listen to them and we talk about them, if we tell any stories, we'll usually tell them, I'm sorry, we used you this week. And they don't care. They don't mind. We have a really tight family. And so they're grateful. Obviously, we couldn't do the parenting side of it if we didn't have our kids. So they're part of it as well. We've even been able to do a podcast with our daughter and her husband. Over the Christmas when they were home, we recorded a podcast with them. So that was exciting to be able to do. One day, hopefully, we'll get them all together on the podcast.
Now, I don't know if it seems...
Can I add one thing there?
Absolutely. I'm plenty of time.
Just to tag off what she just said, I actually think to some degree our kids many times look forward to... Not that they're looking forward to gleaning the wisdom of mom and dad. Okay, I'm not saying that. But there is like this interesting anticipation as they get to hear from our perspective what they only know from their perspective. And so that actually has been sort of neat as we've shared stories and experiences that we had as parents, because realize our children were experiencing childhood, as they were 3, 4, 5 years old, and they weren't looking at it through adult eyes. We were learning as adults, and so they get to sort of see what we saw. And in the end, I think they get to be brought along in the process. And of course, they do kind of look forward to what unique story are mom and dad going to tell. And thankfully, they're okay with that.
Yeah.
In fact, we went to a parenting conference a couple of weeks ago. Lorrie and I were speaking at in Charlotte, and we texted our kids as we were headed there. I said, just so you know, we're going to be using you as examples today, and so they're good with that, which is a good thing.
And if you listen to the podcast, they're not super embarrassing stories. They're just talking about how normal family life is. And I was going to ask you this. It's also not necessarily in the topic, but I think it's true. As we grew up looking as young parents or soon-to-be parents, we started looking for people who would be examples in our lives. I know you guys were like this. You probably asked a lot of questions. I know you guys are very observant. One of the reasons we started this podcast, Josh and I, is that we often got a lot of questions from people. And I remember as being a young missionary, wanting to be a missionary, and asking many of the missionaries here on the field, how did you start your church? And I was amazed by how many didn't necessarily remember, didn't have any kind of, well, I don't really, it was so long ago. And so we found that sometimes even in parenting, people who how did you raise your kids so well or this? And a lot of people maybe didn't think about it and communicate it. One of the things you guys have done a good job, I think, is probably you looked for podcasts and you probably didn't find very many good ones and thought, hey, we should, not that, like you said, we have all the answers, but just, we had a good experience. We followed good examples. And we want to communicate that to people who are asking us those same questions. We get questions from young missionaries, how to do this, X, Y, and Z. And so one of the reasons Josh and I had basically made this treasure trove of things is so young people can look at that. Not that we have all the answers, but this was our experience. Have you found that to be the same case with people asking you a lot and just saying, hey, this is kind of what our experience was. We observed this and we implemented this, and this was kind of the result?
Sure. So early on, we did have, because I've listened to podcasts for quite a while now, been in podcasting in different levels of ministry for several years. And there were several parenting and marriage podcasts that I would recommend. In fact, there are still several that I recommend to other people to listen to. But I think what was missing, or what I didn't see, is that a lot of the podcasts were either on marriage, and it was this very formal perspective on marriage, or it was on parenting. And I think sometimes the parenting ones were very informal, almost like a daily vlog of mom and dad and talking about their kids.
You be you.
And it was super personal, the life. So what we wanted to do was to tie the two together and always make sure that though we're sharing life experiences, we are trying to teach a lesson from God's word and really ground it in scripture. Can you separate marriage and parenting? Yes. And so there are plenty of good marriage podcasts and parenting podcasts. But what we found for us is if our marriage wasn't strong, then we would have struggled in parenting. And sometimes the things that made us the best parents were when we had the strongest marriage.
Right.
So you really can you disconnect marriage and parenting in the sense that you can have a single mom? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. In the sense that you can have a dad whose wife has left or passed away and he's raising 3 kids.
Right.
Yes, it doesn't have to be about marriage, but in God's design, which is a husband and wife with raising children, apart from the tragedies that happen or divorce or things like that, apart from that, that's God's plan, and it really does work best together. So that's what we were just trying to fill, was that gap of having marriage and parenting together, life experiences, but also always pointing people back to God's word.
I also would say that though there's plenty of theology and biblical principles in the podcast, it is extremely practical. You're taking your experiences and you're showing how you guys started from young children to the stage you're at now, and how you took those principles and put them into practice in your life. And though we all understand it doesn't always fit the same for every person, there's a real connection of practicality there. And so with that in mind, how did you kind of come up and develop the topics in which you guys have spoke on? We're going to get into some of those topics specifically. Did they kind of stem mostly from your experiences or counseling or both? I'm going to turn this to Lorrie.
DJ comes up with those. No, part of it is through experiences and just things that we learned, particularly as our children were younger. It took us a while to decipher, for instance, I know our 3 Ds for discipline. It's really easy when you're, especially with your first child, you're disciplining for everything and you don't have clear guidelines for particularly biblical corporal punishment. And so I think a lot of our topics just came through the experiences that we had. We also look at struggles that we see families having in culture today.
Right.
It's a difficult world to be starting a family in, but that doesn't mean that it can't be done and it can't be done well. And so a lot of our topics, we see struggles that families are having, particularly in Christian homes, facing the world that we have. And so we will do topics just looking out and seeing what specifically could we use to encourage parents today.
Yeah.
Because today is different than 25 years ago when we first had Caitlin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the world's changed probably more in the last 5 to 10 years than ever before. And it's true, a lot of times, we might see good experiences and we try to follow people who raise their children well, and hopefully we can say that we did our best. But oftentimes what comes to our mind, and maybe specific topics like that, are seeing bad examples or people who are really struggling and thinking, wow, they really need some help, And so with that in mind, let's talk about some of the topics, because I know you've got almost 2+ seasons now worth of topics. What have been some of your more favorite topics to cover, like anticipating, okay, we're going to cover this topic, and whether it's preparation or being more organic about it, what have been some of your favorite ones to talk about together?
So I'll hit that. Let me go back and tag on what you just said when it comes to how we come up with our counseling, our podcast topics. Like she said, it's often life situations. It's also sometimes situations that we see in people that we're counseling, like real issues that are coming up in people's lives, or questions that people ask, or situations that we see people struggling with. Then we will get in the car, we reflect back on what we would have done in that situation, and then we'll look at each other and say, that needs to be a podcast topic, and we'll jot it down. And then that's something that we'll develop and something that we'll talk about. Actually, develop's a very structured word. We don't really develop topics like we used to. When we first started, we did develop every episode. We had our points. Right. We had every biblical reference. We had our intro, conclusion, everything we want to say. Now we sort of brainstorm. Mm-hmm. Normally, sometimes I'll even pop an episode in her.
He was already doing podcasts, so he was very good at it. I not so much. So we had
you didn't do podcasts there all the time?
Yeah, we had to do all that planning for my sake. Now I'm like, just go with it.
We've gotten a lot better with that. And so now we kind of have a topic, and we'll have a general ballpark of these are the 3 things we want to hit. Right. And then we just start. But the good thing is we're trying to always take things that had life experiences for us. And so rarely do we talk about topics that we did not experience. So there are some topics that we just don't cover on our podcast. Right. In fact, we've been challenged at our last parenting conference. There are questions that come up often with parenting that we don't have experiential answers to, because we never struggled with a hard-willed child. Yeah, we did. So when that question comes up, often we're sort of left it like we can't share. Well, here's what we did, or here's the 10 steps we did, or the 5 things. We just don't have that. So there are life experiences we can't draw from because we never experienced them. And so we try to focus on the things that we did go through, especially as we see them. So what are some of the favorite topics that we have? So I think if you wanted to narrow down our parenting topics and our marriage topics, to one, I think I know what each of them would be. Okay. So let's see how we can do this. Okay. Lorrie, you want to tell me what you think they are? And obviously you're just going to have to trust me if I know them, right? Because I know what I think they are. Lorrie, what do you think they would be? What would be if we could narrow down a theme topic's not the right word, a theme.
Right.
The theme of our parenting side, what do you think our theme would be?
Balance in the home.
That's a great one. That's a great one. That's not the theme I was thinking of. That's okay.
Because I'm thinking balance in discipline, balance in how you spend time together, balance in what you allow to come into your home.
Okay, so that's going to give us two parenting topics.
Mm-hmm.
The one that I focused on, or I think has sort of summarizes, is that as parents, God's the job of Christian parenting is not to how did we phrase it in our
Not to raise godly children.
not to raise up godly children, but to raise up godly adults.
Mm-hmm.
And so everything that you do is for the express purpose of handing them off to the Lord in adulthood. So we can dig into those for a second. For marriage, what would you say?
You went on.
Oh, I don't know. Yours is really
Funny, when you were asking the question, I have listened to every episode, but most, my concept was also basically preparing your child for the world.
Sure. Okay. And what would you say for marriage? Especially linked to parenting.
Oh, well, in order to be the right kind of parent, you have to be the right husband and wife. And it took us, if you have listened to our podcast, or if you do, you'll see it said many times when we're talking about marriage that it took us several years into marriage before we recognized our biblical roles as husband and wife. And so I think that's one of the major themes all throughout is when you get that perspective right, when you as a wife recognize what God created you as a wife to do and as a husband to do, then that helps you with your role as mother and father. Then that's when your family really starts to be the family that God intended for you to be.
And that is the actual one I had for marriage as well. So that was good. So we were 50% there. Yeah, I would say for marriage, the theme that keeps coming up is since we are connecting marriage to parenting, and because that's our life experience, if your marriage isn't right, then you're probably going to struggle in parenting. Mm-hmm. And if your marriage isn't right, then when your kids leave home and you hit that empty nest, then the separation rate, the divorce rate just skyrockets and we've seen that, and it breaks our hearts when we see people our age who are 25 to 30 years invested in marriage, and as their kids leave the home, they get divorces because they weren't building their marriage. As far as the parenting, the two topics we talked about seem to come up a lot. Finding balance in parenting, making sure you balance out discipline and love, making sure you balance out, rules, but also having fun and enjoying your kids, finding balance between your marriage and raising your children. So finding balance. And then the theme that sort of hits often in parenting is that God has called us as parents not to raise up godly children, because I think that's where we sometimes get stuck on. We think, I want little Johnny to be the best 10-year-old he can be. And God has called me to train little Johnny or little Susie. Johnny and Susie get used a lot in our illustrations. Little Johnny or little Susie.
Used to reading stories.
Oh, yeah.
Little Johnny and little Susie to be godly children. But if that's our goal, then that's a short-sighted goal. Mm-hmm. It only lasts for about 5 years before they become teenagers. The goal is to raise up godly adults, which means everything I do today has the purpose of looking forward to the point where they move into adulthood, where the point where we let go of them. We are stewards of our children. They are not our possession. And so everything I do today, everything we do in parenting is to prepare them for that point when we let them go out and serve the Lord. And by the way, it makes it much easier to let go at that point if you have been thinking that direction your whole life. If for 18 years of your child's life, you've been thinking, you're my child, hold on, then when they turn 18 and God calls them into missions, let's use that as an example. They're in college and God calls them on the mission field. It's pretty easy. It's pretty hard at that point to then say, okay, go.
Yeah.
But if you have been raising your child the whole time saying, you're not mine, but I'm raising you up to serve the Lord however he wants. Then when God says it's the mission field, then it's pretty easy to say, all right, Lord, you've been preparing us for this, and let your child go off and do what God wants them to do.
Yeah, specifically those two podcasts you're mentioning, one about the biblical roles in marriage. I remember that resonating with me very much. I think you told a story about coming to a certain point in the marriage and life when you felt your need to lead more spiritually. And I remember specifically that being something I applied more in my life after that, because you gave real life experiences about, it wasn't that you had a bad marriage or you weren't raising your kids right, but you realize, maybe you weren't fulfilling the role exactly the way you should have been. And I think specifically in this day and age with so much confusion, so much pushback on the roles of husband and wife, that's one of the topics that I feel like Christian couples just have to hear over and over again. I think in our evangelical world, people are very afraid to talk about this.
Right.
There's a lot of fear in that. But to just talk on it biblically and give real perspectives shows how a family can flourish in that way.
Right.
And it doesn't come from a domineering dictator role or, humility in submission, but that we're all submitting, but fulfilling those roles. And so I really encourage our listeners to go back and listen to that podcast. It's very informative, very practical. I think that show great results in your family when everyone knows their job and fulfilling it. And then the one you're talking about in preparation, I remember specifically, we were actually sending our kids off a couple of years ago to a camp. They were driving with our home church 14 hours. And maybe a few days before it happened, we realized some of the things they were going to be doing, and we realized our kids had never walked into a store and ordered their own combo meal or something. I think maybe I'll even use an example, something like that. And we were like, wow, there's so much here that we feel like we're trying to fulfill in training them biblically, but there's a practical side of life of applying that. Like you said, not necessarily raising godly children, but godly adults, godly Christians. And so those two topics really resonated with us. Have you, through social media or interaction with people, have specific topics that you feel like people have reacted most positively to?
So let me talk about that topic that you just mentioned. The one of the greatest benefits for our family, and apart from the godly influences that you mentioned earlier, that we had several godly influences in our life that we're thankful for. But apart from that, one of the greatest benefits for our family was when I became a youth pastor. Mm-hmm. Because as a youth pastor, I'm now taking care of everybody else's 4th through 6th grader when we went to camp. I'm taking care of everybody else's teenagers at camp and on youth group and youth activities. And I got to see firsthand the results of, if you have a 15-year-old, I got to see the results of 15 years of child rearing. And we had 80 kids in our youth group and 35 kids that we took to junior camp. So that's over 100 kids that we got to look at and say, yeah, those 5 kids right there, that's how we want our kids to be. And sadly, the number of kids, it was maybe in the 10 to 15%. And we found that if we were to just parent like everyone else parents, then our kids are going to turn out, when I say like everyone else's kids, I mean, we were going to struggle with just common issues that sadly should not be common. Yeah. They should not be common in the body of Christ.
Exactly.
But they are, because we don't follow biblical principles in parenting. So we looked at those 10 to 15 teenagers, and we looked at their parents. Now, remember, our kids were much smaller at that point. So their parents were older than us, typically. No, they would have been older than us, which meant we were able to look up to those parents, and we were able to watch, okay, how did they discipline their children? How did they raise their children? How did they raise their family? What priorities did they have? And that sort of then gave us models to follow after. As far as social media and trying to get interaction, I'll be honest, we don't do a lot. I mean, we have a Facebook page. Mm-hmm. And I actually at one point started a Facebook group for the podcast. And I was thinking about, trying to build some type of what is called like a online community, a social media community. And I think those can be profitable. But I was basing that on the model that I saw for those other podcasts that are very well-produced, more commercially available podcasts. And I just realized early on that was a path that we just weren't going to go down. Like in the end, if all that we do is produce audio for people that moms and dads can listen to encourage them in their marriage, to encouraging them in their parenting, even if we get nothing in return and they're not connecting to us and we don't have social media followers, that's fine. We're not about that. In the end,
We don't have time for that.
we just don't have time for it.
Yeah.
So now the downfall to that is social media is a great way to build community and connection. And that's great. So we don't have a lot of interaction with people that listen. I'll tell you what is fun though, when we go to churches or when we're visiting people on the mission field or when we're at a parenting conference and when people come up to us and say, oh man, you're DJ and Lorrie. Oh, can I get a picture? We love listening to your podcast. And I'm like, oh my goodness. Like it's an honor. No, it's an honor to meet people that like really listen and like to hear you, Eric, to hear you talk about episodes that have been impactful for you. That gives us the motivation to keep going and keep doing it because that's the whole purpose.
Yeah, man. For us, we've always, and I think those who understand mentorship, you never try to find a mentor that's your age. You always look for a mentor that's a life stage ahead, 1 or 2, and like you said, have fulfilled those biblical principles, have lived them out, and they're still following them. And so that's an encouragement for us. Is though we're close to the same age, we got married a little later in life, so a life stage ahead. We have common friends, the Phillips family. That was someone who was paramount in our lives as mentors and people we looked at and how we wanted to raise our kids. And so that's an encouragement. No parent thinks they've got it all figured out. We all understand all of our deficits, but to be able to share experiences that were positive is always an encouragement. And so I'm sure you do get feedback. So maybe it's not on social media, but like you say, when you go to conferences, you all have spoken at the Wilds. We listen to that. And so I'm sure that's an encouragement to find that it's not falling on deaf ears.
Sure.
I would say we've even had a couple families reach out to us by finding connections through Facebook.
Right.
And they're a hurting family.
Yes.
And they need somebody to help them through struggles and difficulties. And they've listened to our podcast. And the Lord's allowed us to be the ones to be able to walk through that family, through the struggles and difficulties that they've had. And we didn't even know who they were till they actually reached out to us. And so that's a blessing to realize that God is using the experiences that you've gone through to be able to then encourage others. And sometimes they're experiences that we have not experienced, but yet we can still be an encouragement because God's word is the answer for everything.
Yeah. So this is a missionary podcast. So we're going to put it slightly through the filter of missions. And you guys are a family that loves missions and missionaries, spent many times visits on the mission field. What are some of the topics that you've discussed that you feel specifically, if there's a missionary family listening, that would be encouraging? Some of the ones we already talked, I think, are encouraging, but with your experience in missions and when you all spoke about, what do you think would be an encouragement to missionaries today?
So one topic that comes to my mind would be the importance of finding balance between parenting and your ministry. This was something that early on, Lorrie and I kind of struggled with. And for those that have listened to our podcast, you know that when God called me into ministry 20 years ago, this was something that we were concerned about because we had seen so many pastors and missionaries from previous generations. And let me just pause here and say, every generation has their issues.
Yep.
Our children are going to grow up and they're going to be doing podcasts, which will there'll be something different at that point. I don't know what it'll be. They'll be doing something and they'll talk about our generation and the weaknesses of our generation. So I don't say that saying that we're perfect so that we're judging others, but we can only go by our experiences. Yep. And our experience is that the previous generation in missions or in ministry often gave 100% to the Lord. And I'm thankful for that, but they sometimes did that at the expense of their family. And so after years of ministry, you would have a husband and wife who had given everything to the Lord in pastoral ministry or everything to the Lord in missions, and yet their family wasn't what it could have been. So our encouragement to this generation of missionary and to this generation of ministry leader, pastors, youth pastors, is that there is a way to find that perfect balance between what God has called you, between all the things God has called you to do. I think we're going to talk about this maybe in another episode. But if God has called you both to parent and in marriage, and God has called you to ministry, then in God's perfect plan, all three of those exist in harmony, and you don't have to sacrifice one for the other. And I think the knee-jerk reaction of our generation is that we have seen a wholesale devotion to ministry at the expense of family, and now our knee-jerk reaction is we then lean to a wholesale focus on family, and sometimes that comes at the expense of ministry. And if God has called you to both marriage and parenting and ministry, then all three of those can exist in perfect harmony in God's perfect plan. But you do have to find that balance. And so early on, we just determined we were going to try to find that balance in ministry. Our children were involved with us in ministry. It was never Dad's going off to do his work as youth pastor, and that's separate from the family. We did it together. We involved our children in ministry, even when they were too young to be involved in youth ministry. They were still involved in all the planning and preparation for VBS and for youth activities. Then when we moved to North Carolina, it ramped up, because now, I'm the only pastor on staff there at the church. And so our children were just part of ministry. And I made sure our church knew that, but then we also made sure when it was family time, it was family time. And we spent time with our kids and enjoyed vacations and enjoyed that time away. And so I would say that's probably the biggest take we've learned from ministry that I would think would apply to missions.
And I think another topic that we have in there that applies to missionaries is the one you mentioned earlier about the purpose of why we have children. It's not to raise good children, it's to raise good adults. And our hopes and our desires, we all have what we think our children are going to do as they get older.
Right.
And I'll save the podcast example for when you go and listen to that podcast. But we all have our ideas, but being willing to let God work in our children's hearts and then take them wherever. And that can be hard. We want our kids to be right where we are. But I am thankful now that my kids are at that stage, and I have, I don't know what God's going to do with our third child right now, who's studying to be a nurse. I could see the Lord using her on the mission field with nursing, and that could take her all over the world in a nursing capacity. But that's so exciting to me. I tell my kids, no matter where you are in the world, you're an airplane ride away. And so go fly, do what God has created you and what God has called you to do. And I can always come and visit you and see some wonderful places in the world. So I think that particular topic, because that's hard when you are outside of the comforts of the U.S., but also if your kids have grown up in your mission field, that's their own. Mm-hmm. And then to see if God calls them somewhere else, that can be a difficult thing. Because in the States, pretty much wherever you go, it's about the same. I mean, there's differences, north, south, east, west, but pretty much you feel safe no matter where your kids are in the States. But when God starts calling them someplace other than where you are, that can be hard. But I think that's a topic. And we have a few podcasts in there that deal with that conversation.
If I can add to that, that was a hard lesson for me as we were beginning the process of helping our children make decisions for the future, of stepping back and letting the Lord guide them, letting the Lord give wisdom. I think one of the things I've perceived as a pastor that missionary kids often struggle with is the pressure to feel like they have to come back to the mission field. Now, I said this to your kids the other day, so this is not something that I don't say to kids. Your kids have a very unique set of skills because they have grown up on the mission field. And I do believe that God often equips, I always believe that God equips us for what he calls us to do. So if your children have very unique skills because they grew up in the Dominican Republic, they're fluent in Spanish, they understand the culture, they understand how to interact with people here, that skill is something God will use in them at some point in the future, whether it's on the mission field or whether it's as a nurse or as a teacher or you name whatever the skill is. But I think often our children feel the pressure in ministry that they have to now perform at the same level, and I use that in air quotes for those that are listening to the podcast and not watching, the same level of ministry, because they feel like if we're not in full-time Christian ministry like mom and dad, then we've failed.
Yeah.
We had to communicate that early on to our kids. Listen, we want you to do whatever God calls you to do. And if that's full-time ministry, great. But if that's being a nurse, great. If that's being a plumber, great. If that's being, you name the occupation. And I think it's important for us to communicate that verbally to our kids. We may say, well, my kids know. No, they don't. Like we need to communicate that. And missionary kids do struggle with that. And so for them to know, when I come back to the States, they're already going to face enough struggle interacting with and trying to acclimate back to a new culture. But just knowing that mom and dad are behind them 100%, no matter what God calls them to do, and not to feel like they have to come back. I have found it interesting, Eric, and then I'll be done with this topic, that several missionaries that we support that are second generation, even a third generation missionary, came to the States, went to college, were planning on doing something else. And it wasn't until they finally came to the point where they said, okay, Lord, I'm willing to do whatever, that God knocked on their heart and said, I want you to go back.
Right.
And then they realized, I'm going back because God called me, not because daddy called me.
Right.
And there's nothing worse than a child coming back to the mission field because their daddy called.
Yep.
They need to be God called, which means you've got to step back and say, all right, let God do the work and give your kids that room to let God work in their hearts.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things I've noticed is we've watched missionary families who are older than us send their kids back, and we see some of the good examples, bad examples. But for us, I think one of the things that's hit us recently and why we're seeking after podcasts like your own is that time goes by so quickly, and before you blink, you're having to make these decisions. As Miss Lorrie was talking about, it's one thing for you guys from North Carolina to send your kids down to Florida, and there's major transitions that you have to deal with the family. It's the other when you've lived in a third culture, a third kid culture, and you're sending them back to your first culture that they don't know. And what happens, I think, is that not so much that people don't have the biblical principles or aren't thinking about it. I think it creeps up on them.
Sure.
And I think that preparation. And so that's why I encourage people to listen to the Better Together podcast, because I think the majority of your podcasts are the stage of life you've just completed or going through, where you're transitioning your kids from home to college to married life, because that's what's most fresh. I mean, we do talk about raising children, and one day you will talk about grandkids, hopefully. But it is most fresh in your mind. And so I would encourage those parents who maybe have young teenagers or, teenagers that are getting ready to shove off, these would be good podcasts, because it is so true. I think most missionaries I do know, it is probably more of our generation now, not necessarily to guilt your kids into coming back. I think it probably did happen, and it probably does still happen. But I think most people don't do that. They do want their kids to choose. And then, unfortunately, sometimes people who don't have great experiences, the last thing they want their kid to do is come back. And so it's encouraging to see your kids not necessarily be forced in the ministry, but sort of choose it. And we feel the same way. If our kids are going to be writers or school teachers, we're going to be just as happy if they're missionaries or pastors, as long as they're serving the Lord and godly young men and young ladies. But so I do encourage the listeners specifically to seek out topics where it comes to preparation for your kids to be leaving the home, basically. And so for missionaries, there may be some added things on that list of things to figure out, whether it be driving or, anything they may have never experienced. But there's so many of those things that are still applicable to whether it's U.S. ministry or all, around the world ministry, international ministry, as we would call it.
Sure.
As a funny side note, if you are outside of the States, go ahead and let your kids learn how to drive in your foreign country, because if they can drive there, the U.S. will be simple. Every country I've gone to, the driving is crazy. I thought the States was crazy, not till you go outside of the States.
Yes, that is always a topic of conversation to talk to missionaries to see whose country is crazier.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to wrap this up, and we talked a little bit about social media, but Pastor, you don't only have the podcast with your wife, you also have a YouTube channel where you talk about a lot of contemporary theological issues. What's the name of that, or the site for that we can find?
So if you go to YouTube and just search because that's going to be your sign or whatever, at DJ Harry Teaches. DJ Harry Teaches. And so in that, I try to hit biblical topics that sometimes are a little edgy, but I'm trying to look at those topics from a biblical perspective. For example, this last week, I recorded it before we came here to the Dominican, but I released a video specifically on the Bible and alcohol. Now, about a year ago, I did a video that was a full study on all of the words in the New Testament and Old Testament. So that video is still out there. But this one was specifically on what does wisdom say from God's word? You know, a lot of people will say, you know, well, is drinking a sin? Show me the verse where it says drinking is sin. Yes. Sin. And so in this video, I simply said, okay, let's back up for a second. Even without that verse, because there's no verse that says that, even without that verse, if we look at biblical wisdom, God's wisdom is very clear. Yeah. There's a path of wisdom, there's a path of foolishness, so choose wisdom. And so often I'm hitting topics like that, topics about Baptists that often people look at and misunderstand. And you know, the Lord's Supper, why can only saved people participate in the Lord's Supper? Do we believe baptism saves, which we don't? And so I try to explain some of those uniquenesses about the Baptist faith as it applies to God's word. And so that's at DJ Harry Teaches. And then our website for the podcast is growingbettertogether.org. And from there, you can just launch in. We are on most of the podcast platforms, yes. And so you can just listen to us there.
Yeah, what I really enjoy about Pastor's theological YouTube channel, and it's theological but practical at the same time, is, you know, I found this as a pastor. A lot of times people ask me a very large question, and sometimes you can direct them to a book or a long study on it, but sometimes what they need is a bite-sized bite to get them started down a path, you know, to get their mind, okay, because sometimes you give someone an hour and a half podcast to listen to, or a 2-hour podcast, and they're not sure about that. But if you give them 12 minutes, 13 minutes, they say, all right, I get that perspective. Now I want to know more.
And Eric, I'm actually struggling a little bit with that, because the pastor side of me says,
I know.
I can't answer this question in 10 minutes. It's got to be an hour. And so what I try to do is I try to narrow the question down to something that I can hit in 8 to 10 minutes, because the way YouTube works, it's just, it is what it is. People come to YouTube and they click on and click off. So you have to talk about something that's very relevant to people. You have to get right to the point. You have to talk to it in about 6 to 8 minutes, you know, because people are going to be clicking off to other things. So I've sort of adapted what I do to that platform to make shorter videos. And that's a challenge, to be honest with you.
Well, it's important that sometimes people just keep going down the right path. And I think that's really good. And there's more resources out there, but giving succinct answers sometimes are not, it's not easy. In fact, I remember one famous theologian said that the hardest thing to do is to say, 2 hours worth of truth in 35 minutes. And so that is very difficult. Well, we want to thank you for being a part of our ministry this week. We want to thank you for joining us live. We want to encourage our listeners to find the Better Together podcast on your major podcast platforms. Start downloading those old episodes, wait for new ones, and subscribe to this podcast. And we will be back later on with another podcast with Pastor Harry. And we want to thank you guys for being here today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eric. We enjoyed it.